Hi there. I'm going to read my favorite quote from Chapter 3 of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And this is really, this might be my favorite part in the book, or it's certainly a part that really got me thinking, and in the ways that this book can really change the way you see things in a way that's more productive, especially nowadays. All right, so they've run away. Really, they've gone like 100 miles an hour on their motorcycles to get away from the impending storm. And now they're in a motel and they're hanging out and drinking whiskey and sour. And Chris is thinking about ghost stories and ghosts and things like that. One of the kids at the YMCA camp says he believes in ghosts. This is Chris talking. He was just spoofing you. That's Robert talking. No, he wasn't. He said that when people haven't been buried right, their ghosts come back to haunt people. He really believes that. He was just spoofing you, I repeat. What's his name, Sylvia says. Tom Whitebear. John and I exchanged looks, suddenly recognizing the same thing. Oh, Indian, he says. I laugh. I guess I'm going to have to take that back a little, I say. I was thinking of European ghosts. Now, of course, European ghosts are like what you see in a haunted house, what you see in Hamlet, or I think Hamlet's the one that has a ghost in it. Maybe I'm wrong. Jacob Marley, a certain type of ghost that's sort of a dead person, some kind of shade of a dead person, looks exactly like a person, but is made out of mist or something. Very logical way of imagining what a ghost is, a very European way. What's the difference? John roars with laughter. He's got you, he says. I think a little and say, well, Indians sometimes have a different way of looking at things, and which I'm not saying is completely wrong. Science isn't part of the Indian tradition. And of course, in Lila, you can look through this book and you can see themes that will be repeated in Lila, and the Indian theme is a major part of Lila. Tom Whitebear said his mother and dad told him not to believe all that stuff. But he said his grandmother whispered it was true anyway, so he believes it. He looks at me pleadingly. He really does want to know things sometimes. Being facetious is not being a very good father. Sure, I say, reversing myself. I believe in ghosts too. Now John and Sylvia look at me peculiarly. I see I'm not going to get out of this one easily and brace myself for a long explanation. It's completely natural, I say, to think of Europeans who believed in ghosts or Indians who believe in ghosts as ignorant. The scientific point of view has wiped out every other view to a point where they all seem primitive. So if a person today talks about ghosts or spirits, he is considered ignorant or maybe nutty. It's just all but completely impossible to imagine a world where ghosts can actually exist. So that's a really important paragraph, and it's easy to gloss over. It's easy to say, oh, that's so novel that he's talking about this world where ghosts can actually exist. So note also what he says here. The scientific point of view, not science, but the scientific point of view, which says he's framing science as a way of seeing. And this, I think, becomes a really important point in Persick's work. If you remember, in Lila, there's a section about the green flash. And the green flash represents the invisible things you can see and useful invisible things you can see if you've got the right teacher or if you've got the right lens. At the time this book came out, that was a mind-blowing shift that Persick was trying to introduce into the public consciousness. And in general, still, we see science as incontrovertible. Scientific evidence is reality to us. There is cause and effect. A thing is here, and then it causes this, and it's over here. This reacts with that, and you get that. It's very predictable. This is the way reality works. If you can't prove it with this stuff, it's not reality. If you can't prove it with a scientific experiment, it's not reality. And everything can be reduced to an essential substance somehow. And this is, of course, what most people think. We've been taught to think this way. And according to some, physics is not advancing because we can't get out of this mindset. And the word mindset, how Pirsig is putting this, why would you say mindset when this is reality? But Pirsig says no. Nowadays, of course, there's some pushback on this. I mean, remember, this book is this year 50 years old. So since this book, and I think Pirsig was helpful in this, he wrote a wave of a change in consciousness about how we see materialism. And you'll see this with some of the more enlightened scientists. You'll see this with some of the consciousness studies. You'll see this with people like Ian McGilchrist. A lot of people that you see in this little corner, that we refer to in this little corner, who influence this corner. Pajot, of course, and Mathieu have the cosmic language versus the scientific language in there, and that one of them is starting not to work so well. So these themes in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, this is why this book was so important to me, because it really made me understand that this scientific reality isn't necessarily reality. It's just one way to see reality. So nowadays you have scientists who are revering the mystery again, right? And you see science and spirituality coming together. I mean, and this has gone on for a while. I'm not saying that this happened, yesterday. This is an ongoing process, but it's really interesting to actually get some language and understanding around these concepts in Pirsig that he really lays out, initially right here in chapter 3, and then continues in the rest of the book. That this really, the way he's framing this whole ghost thing is a big part of the theme of the book and of his work. John nods affirmatively, and I continue. My own opinion is that the intellect of modern man isn't that superior. Our IQs aren't that different. So that's interesting, right? The statement he made about primitive and nutty, not necessarily. IQs are not much different. That's very true. Those Indians and medieval men were just as intelligent as we are, but the context in which they thought was completely different. Within that context of thought, ghosts and spirits are quite as real as atoms, particles, photons, and quants are to modern man. And in a sense, I believe in ghosts. Modern man has his ghosts and spirits too, And again, like when someone might have read this in 1974, they might have just, said, oh, that's very novel, and glossed over the real significance of what he's saying. What? Oh, the laws of physics and logic, the number system, the principle of algebraic substitution, those are ghosts. We just believe in them so thoroughly they seem real. They seem real to me, John says. I don't get it, says Chris. So I go on. For example, it seems completely natural to presume that gravitation and the law of gravitation existed before Isaac Newton. It would sound nutty to think that until the 17th century there was no gravity. Of course. So when did this law start? Has it always existed? John is frowning, wondering what I'm getting at. What I'm driving at, I say, is the notion that before the beginning of the earth, before the sun and stars were formed, before the primal generation of anything, the law of gravity existed. Sure. Sitting there, having no mass of its own, no energy of its own, not in anyone's mind because there wasn't anyone, and not in space because there was no space either, not anywhere. This law of gravity still existed. Now John seems not so sure. If that law of gravity existed, I say, I honestly don't know what a thing has to do to be non-existent. It seems to me that the law of gravity has passed every test of non-existence there is. You can't think of a single attribute of non-existence that the law of gravity doesn't have, or a single scientific attribute of existence it did have, and yet it is still common sense to believe that it existed. John says, I guess I have to think about it. Well, I predict if you think about it long enough, you will find yourself going round and round and round and round till you finally reach only one possible rational, intelligent conclusion. The law of gravity and gravity itself did not exist before Isaac Newton. No other conclusion makes sense. So you see what he's saying here. He's saying here. He's saying that we don't question that humanity has always held in our minds this law of gravity. That this law of gravity is so indelibly positioned in our psyche that we can't imagine it never not being an absolute part of reality. But like you're saying, how can you prove that this exists? And scientific mindset that we're so that we're so entrenched in, this law doesn't, this doesn't pass muster, right? It is totally immaterial. So the fact that this law of gravity and other physical laws have always existed is not true. There are many ways of seeing reality, and Newtonian physics is just one. These physics have decided that the fact that when an apple falls out of the tree, that certain force, when the apple that's something to pay attention to. It hits Newton on the head and he goes, whoa, I need to pay attention to that. To categorize it, to study it. To study this force, of course, will help us predict, and that ability to predict will help us conquer nature to our benefit, which is, of course, the shift in mindset that happened between the medieval times and the Enlightenment. The way of controlling nature was a very different mindset. It wasn't like we are superior and we're going to pin it down and we're going to get to the top. We're going to become God. It was more like, how can we exist they didn't think it out like this, but the way people existed was in concert with nature and doing their best to survive, and technology kind of came from that. But at that point, we weren't thinking, we're going to pin this down and win. But this understanding is really recent, that we're supposed to take these phenomena and study them. And this has to do with the mentality that has to dissect the holistic nature of reality, of phenomenological experience in terms of getting some kind of handle on it. There was a time when humans didn't feel the need to get a handle on the experience of God's hand in nature. The mentality at that time was we trusted in nature, we trusted in the whole of nature, and death wasn't the absolute end. And that's one thing that happens when you start seeing things in this way. Then death is an absolute end, and it's there's an inherent nihilism in that. These people didn't see death as an absolute end. They saw it as, some variation of rejoining the cosmos. And now when you're looking, and this way of thinking is coming back into our understanding. I was looking at Theories of Everything. Had a little poll, and obviously that audience is going to be biased in this direction. But almost 50% said what happens when you die is you rejoin the cosmos, you transcend. And they didn't mean it in going to heaven type way. They meant it in this much older understanding of nature and our place in it. And that we are such a part of nature that death doesn't mean the end, really. And it's interesting, near-death experiences kind of give us a little bit of evidence in this. And what that means, I say, is before he can interrupt. And what that means is the law of gravity exists nowhere except in people's heads. It's a ghost. We are all of us very ignorant and conceited about running down other people's ghosts, but just as ignorant and barbaric and superstitious about our own. Why does everyone believe in the law of gravity then? Mass hypnosis in a very orthodox form known as education. So I want to go back to that. When I mentioned the green flash, education means that you're taking these concepts and you're putting them in kids' heads, and this is going to be your worldview, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a scientific or materialistic worldview. It may very well be a previous worldview that they had in medieval times or earlier, where you're much more part of nature, or it may be something going forward where we reintegrate that, where we're trying to. There are certain corners that are trying to reintegrate some of this old way of thinking. You mean the teacher's hypnotizing the kids into believing the law of gravity? Sure, that's absurd. You've heard about, this is funny, you've heard of the importance of eye contact in the classroom. Every educationist emphasizes it. No educationist explains it. John shakes, and one thing I want to say about this is you can do a psychological, scientific neuroscience experiment about mirror neurons and looking in the eye and all that stuff. But there's an innate understanding of eye contact that you don't need a scientific experiment for, and that people have known since the dawn of time. John shakes his head and pours me another drink. He puts his hand over his mouth and in a mock aside says to Sylvia, "You know, most of the time he seems like such a normal guy." I counter, "That's the first normal thing I've said in weeks. The rest of the time I'm feigning 20th century lunacy just like you are. So as not to draw attention to myself. But I'll repeat it for you, I say. We believe the disembodied words of Sir Isaac Newton were sitting in the middle of nowhere billions of years before he was born, and that magically he discovered these words. They were always there, even when they applied to nothing. Gradually the world came, this is so perfect, gradually the world came into being and then applied it to it. Gradually the world came into being and then they applied to it. In fact, those words themselves were what formed the world. That, John, is ridiculous. The problem, the contradiction the scientists are stuck with is that of the mind. Mind has no matter or energy, but they can't escape its predominance over everything they do. Logic exists in the mind. Numbers exist only in the mind. I don't get upset when scientists say that ghosts exist in the mind. It's that only that gets me. Science is only in your mind too. It's just that doesn't make it bad, or ghosts either. They're just looking at me, so I continue. The laws of gravity are human inventions like ghosts. Laws of logic, of mathematics are also human inventions like ghosts. The whole blessed thing is a human invention, including the idea that it isn't a human invention. The world has no existence whatsoever outside the human imagination. The world has no existence outside. Listen to this line. The world has no existence whatsoever outside the human imagination. It's all a ghost. And in antiquity was so recognized as a ghost. The whole blessed world we live in, it's run by ghosts. We see what we see because the ghosts show it to us. The ghosts of Moses and Christ and Buddha and Plato and Descartes and Rousseau and Jefferson and Lincoln and on and on and on. Isaac Newton is a very good ghost, one of the best. Your common sense is nothing more than the voices of thousands and thousands of these ghosts from the past. Ghosts and more ghosts. Ghosts trying to find their place among the living. Common sense means, of course, it's obvious that this is real, but these are these voices speaking to you. Later in the book, Pirsig will talk about analogs. Analog on analog on analog, meaning something sticks, something has some kind of valence, and it becomes an entity. And that entity changes and grows and develops, meaning that notions, like the notion of Moses, and I don't mean this in a sacrilegious way, but the notion of Moses, a mythological religious figure, develops over time in our psyche. And then that notion of Moses is codified in the Bible, and then that codification lives in our minds in the Judeo-Christian world. Moses exists as something in our mind, a ghost that guides our morality. And we think this ghost is us. And Newton and his apple, that is our reality. What came before is naive, nutty, childish. We don't see it as real. Reality begins with the fall of that apple. We just wake up out of our naive, primitive slumber into that real reality, like he was saying before. You know, that law of gravity is floating around there waiting for us to be enlightened enough to see it. So I hope that makes sense, and I'll see you next time.